Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. It's Brando. Thank you for joining us today. Today's video, we are going to be talking about America's most romantic criminals, Bonnie and Clyde. We dive into some of their gangs that they were involved with, some of the crimes that they went through, and ultimately what led to their demise. Grab a green tea. I am a little sick today. Get comfortable and let's dive into this, all right? Let's go. Okay, so Bonnie and Clyde, how did it all start? Well, in the heart of the Great Depression, when America was grappled with economic despair, a young couple captured the nation's attention. And their names were Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow. Two outlaws whose love story and crime spree would become the stuff of legend. However, behind their glamorous lifestyle that they portrayed, there was a much darker truth. One of desperation, violence, and a tragic end. So to understand Bonnie and Clyde, we first must dive into their beginnings, rooted in poverty and hardship in rural Texas. Let's start with Bonnie. Bonnie Parker was born October 1st in 1910 in Rowena, Texas. She was the second of 3 children in a working class family. Her father was a bricklayer and he died when Bonnie was just 4 years old, leaving her mother to raise the children on her own. However, despite the hardships that they endured, Bonnie was an excellent student. Known for her love of literature and poetry, she had dreams of becoming an actress or a poet, imagining a life far removed from the poverty that she knew. In 1926, Bonnie married a man by the name of Roy Thornton, a petty criminal. Their marriage was rocky, to say the least. Roy was frequently in and out of trouble with the law. However, they did separate a few years later. One interesting tidbit of history that I learned was Bonnie actually kept the wedding ring on up until her death. Now, Clyde Barrow was born March 4th of 1909 in Illes County, Texas. Very similar to Bonnie, Clyde grew up in a poor family, the 5th of 7 children actually, whose parents were tenant farmers and struggled to make ends meet. The Barrow family actually ended up moving to Dallas, Texas, where they lived in a poverty-stricken neighborhood known as the Devil's Back Porch. Clyde was a troubled youth, very rebellious and often getting into trouble with the law. By his late teens, he had already begun a life of petty crime, stealing cars and committing small-time burglaries. In 1930, at the age of 21, Clyde was sent to prison. It was during this time that he vowed never to return to a life of poverty or submission. Now, Bonnie and Clyde met in January of 1930 in a small town of West Dallas. Bonnie was living with a friend and Clyde just happened to show up at the house one day. Their attraction was instant and they quickly fell in love. However, just a few months after meeting is when Clyde was arrested and sentenced to 2 years in prison. Bonnie was devastated, but their love remained strong. During his time in prison, Bonnie would write to him pleading for him to stay out of trouble upon his release. But in March of 1930, she actually managed to smuggle in a pistol, which Clyde later used to escape. However, not long after that, he was recaptured in Middletown, Ohio, after a robbery and was sent to Eastham Prison Farm on April 21st, 1930. While Clyde was in prison, he endured horrific conditions, including physical abuse, hard labor. It was during this time that Clyde became more hardened and bitter, ultimately shaping him into the criminal that we know him today. In 1932, after being paroled, Clyde emerged from prison a changed man. The harsh experiences that he had endured in prison left him with a deep hatred for the justice system and a determination to never be imprisoned again. Now, in March of 1932, Bonnie was actually arrested for a failed robbery attempt, and she was jailed in Texas. She was later released shortly after. Now, Bonnie, being deeply in love with Clyde and looking for excitement, ended up joining Clyde in his life of crime, marking the beginning of their infamous partnership. Together, Bonnie and Clyde embarked on a crime spree that would spawn several states, leaving a trail of violence and bloodshed in their wake. Now, their early crimes were mostly small-time, robbing gas stations, grocery stores, rural banks, things of that nature. But as time went on, their activities became more brazen and dangerous. So one of the first major crimes occurred in April of 1932, when Clyde and his accomplice at the time killed a store owner in a botched robbery. And this happened in Hillsborough, Texas. This murder marked the beginning of a series of violent encounters with law enforcement, which eventually escalated to just full-blown shootouts. In August of 1932, Clyde's brother, Buck Barrow, was released from prison and ultimately joined the gang with his wife, Blanche. The group became known as the Barrow Gang, which included several other criminals who would drift in and out of the gang's activities over the years. The Barrow Gang became most notorious for their daring heists, which unfortunately ultimately ended in violent confrontations with police. They were known to travel across state lines to evade capture, often taking advantage of the broken law system of the time. As the Barrow Gang's crimes became more frequent and violent, their notoriety grew. Newspapers across the country would follow their exploits, often portraying Bonnie and Clyde as glamorous outlaws. However, their life on the run was far from glamorous. The gang often lived in consistent fear of being captured, often sleeping in their car or makeshift campsites. They were always on the move, but just always one step ahead of law enforcement. Despite the hardship, Bonnie and Clyde's love for each other remained unwavering. They were inseparable, and Bonnie was known to be fiercely loyal to Clyde, even though she was often sick or injured during their time on the run. In March of 1933, Buck and Blanche rejoined the gang, and the group's activities became even more dangerous. The gang committed several high-profile bank robberies, and their encounters with law enforcement became increasingly violent. One of the most famous incidents in the Barrow Gang criminal career occurred on April 13th of 1933 in Joplin, Missouri. The gang rented a small apartment in hopes to hide from the law for a little while. However, it was their suspicious behavior that caught the eye of local police, and then police decided to start investigating. When police arrived to the apartment, the gang just opened fire, causing a deadly shootout. Unfortunately, 2 police officers were killed, the first being Newton County Constable John Wesley Harriman and Joplin Police Detective Harry McGinnis. The gang narrowly escaped. However, when they fled, they ended up leaving a lot of personal belongings, weapons, and also a camera with undeveloped film. Once the film was developed, it revealed some what are now very iconic photographs of Bonnie and Clyde and the gang, cementing their status as national celebrities. The images of Bonnie playfully posing with a cigar and a pistol in her hand would just show the couple's rebellious and dangerous lifestyle. In July of 1933, the Barrow Gang was cornered by police at the Dexfield Park in Iowa. Buck Barrow was shot and wounded, and Blanche was ultimately captured. Despite his injuries, Buck was able to escape with the rest of the gang, but he died a few days later due to his wounds. As I mentioned, Blanche was captured and sentenced to 6 years in prison, and she actually suffered from visual impairment for the rest of her life. As their numbers dwindled, Bonnie and Clyde became increasingly isolated. Their crimes became more desperate, and their encounters with law enforcement became even more violent. However, the couple's love for each other remained strong, but they knew their time was running out. In January of 1934, Bonnie and Clyde helped their buddy Raymond Hamilton escape from prison, and unfortunately a guard was killed in the process. Now at this time, the head of the Texas prison system, as well as the governor, had hired former Texas Ranger Captain Frank Hammer to track down the couple. By the middle of 1934, Hammer and his associates began to follow Bonnie and Clyde. And in the spring of 1934, Bonnie and Clyde were evading a growing number of law enforcement agencies determined to bring them to justice. They had literally become public enemy number 1. And for good reason. On May 23, 1934, Bonnie and Clyde were ambushed by law enforcement agencies in Louisiana. The officers had been tipped off to the couple's whereabouts by a friend of the gang. As Bonnie and Clyde were driving down the road to their hideout in Black Lake, Louisiana, around 9:15 a.m. they were gunned down by over 167 bullets. Bonnie was found riddled with bullets, holding a machine gun, a sandwich, and a pack of cigarettes. Clyde, barely recognizable, was clenching a revolver. The ambush marked the end of Bonnie and Clyde's reign of terror, but their legend was just beginning. Their bodies were put on public display, drawing thousands of spectators, and the bullet-riddled car in which they had died ultimately became a symbol for their violent end. The story of Bonnie and Clyde has become a major part in American folklore. They have been romanticized in books, songs, movies, most famously the 1967 film Bonnie and Clyde. Despite their violent crimes, they are often seen as tragic anti-heroes, products of a desperate time in American history. But behind the myth lies a stark reality. Bonnie and Clyde were dangerous criminals whose actions left a trail of devastation and loss. Their legacy serves as a reminder of the depression and lawlessness that characterized the Great Depression in America. A time when many Americans struggled to survive, and some, like Bonnie and Clyde, chose a path of violence for their quest for freedom. In the end, Bonnie and Clyde were not invincible. They were just two young people caught up in a whirlwind of crime, love, and violence, driven by a desperation and desire for freedom. As Bonnie once wrote in her final poem, "Someday they'll go down together, and they'll bury them side by side. To few, it'll be grief. To the law, a relief. But it's death for Bonnie and Clyde." And so the legend of Bonnie and Clyde lives on, a tale of love, crime, and tragedy that continues to captivate the world today. Well, there you guys have it. That is the story of Bonnie and Clyde. I really hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I hope you learned something. I love diving in and doing the research. I am so fascinated by history. And also, I want to hear from you guys. Comment down below. Let me know who I should cover next time. A couple of ideas that I've had is like Jack the Ripper, Carla Homolka, Paul Bernardo. I really want to do a video on them as well. I actually used to live pretty much down the road from where all their crimes happened, but we'll talk about that in a later video. But yeah, I want to hear from you guys. Let me know what you want me to cover next time. And as always, guys, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you guys on the next one. Bye.